Good fences make good neighbors. But what happens when those carefully constructed boundaries are ignored? Tonight we look at 4 stories that will make you wish that fence was a reinforced steel wall. A man looking in the windows at night. Strange sounds coming from the apartment next door. A neighbor out of touch with reality. And a woman who watches everything you do. These are creepy neighbors who would make you want to move. I moved into my house about 8 months ago. It sits in a quiet suburban neighborhood that feels almost like a small town, in that everyone keeps to themselves but waves when you pass by. The place felt normal and safe, or at least that's what I thought. The first time I saw him on my security cam, I didn't think much of it. One morning I woke up and saw the alert on my phone. Motion detected. Groggily, I opened the app to take a look. The timestamp showed it had been taken around 2 in the morning. One of the outside cameras caught someone slowly walking past my living room window. The footage was grainy, showing only a dark figure moving through the frame. I figured it was someone who couldn't sleep, or maybe coming home late from a night shift. But then it happened the next night, and the next, and the next. Over the next few months, my cameras would catch someone standing in my yard, always at night, and always near the windows. Sometimes they'd just stay for a minute or two. Other times they'd stick around for a long while, simply standing there in the darkness. The footage was never clear enough to make out a face, only a silhouette, but I could tell they were looking inside. I started closing all my blinds every night before it got dark. It became a ritual, something I had to do before I could even think about relaxing. The 4th time it happened, I called the police. They were polite but skeptical. One officer reviewed the footage on my laptop, squinting at the grainy black and white image. He told me it could be anyone. Maybe someone cutting through my yard or kids messing around. Even if it was a kid, that didn't excuse them from being peeping Toms. And someone cutting through my yard had no right to look in my windows. It seemed the cops didn't want to do their jobs. Not getting a solid answer started to frustrate me. But then I began to put other things together. Small things that, on their own, might not mean a whole lot. But all the pieces together started to show more of the puzzle. My trash cans would be moved a little, as if someone had been going through them. I'd find footprints in the mulch beneath my bedroom window after it rained. And once I came home to find one of my garden stakes pulled out of the ground and pushed in against the side of my house directly below my bathroom window. I started to notice that the figure would appear on my cameras on the same nights my neighbor had his lights on late. He lived alone in the house next door, a man probably in his late 60s with gray hair and glasses. We'd had some small talk when I first moved in. He seemed harmless enough, was quiet, and kept his lawn immaculate. Still, I got this gut feeling. The height of the figure on my cameras matched his height. The build was about the same, and our houses were close enough that he could easily walk over, do whatever he was doing, and be back home in minutes. My cameras didn't catch his doors, only the side of his house, so I couldn't see when he left or returned. One afternoon, I knocked on his door. I was a little nervous, but I figured if I got to know him better, I could figure out if it was him or not. I tried to keep my voice steady when he answered. I told him about the footage and how someone was repeatedly coming into my yard at night. Tried to make it sound like I didn't suspect him, but was asking him just to see if he noticed anything unusual. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any signs of recognition or guilt. His expression didn't change. He adjusted his glasses and shook his head slowly, saying he found it concerning but that he hadn't seen anyone lurking around. He offered to keep an eye out for me. I pressed forward, my mouth dry. I mentioned that the person on the camera looked like they might be about his height and build, and asked if maybe he'd been outside late at night checking on something. His face hardened. The friendly neighbor mask started to show some cracks. He asked if I was accusing him of something and his tone got defensive. I tried to explain that I was only trying to figure out what was going on, but he cut me off. He insisted he hadn't been in my yard and told me that if I was having problems, I should call the police instead of coming to him making accusations. He then practically slammed the door in my face. That night, I triple-checked every window in the house. I tested each lock twice, and I watched the security camera feed on my phone until my eyes burned. At 1:47 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. I sat up in bed, my stomach got bubbly, and I watched the grainy footage on my phone screen. There he was again, the dark figure, standing at the edge of my yard, but this time he was closer to the camera than usual. Close enough that I could make out more details despite the poor quality. He was wearing what looked like a jacket. His posture was slightly hunched, and he stood there, completely still for nearly 5 minutes, watching my house. Then he did something he'd never done before. He walked right up to my living room window and pressed his face close to the glass. His hands cupped around his eyes to block out the glare. He was trying to see inside. My stomach rolled while I was laying in my bed, watching this happen in real time on my phone, knowing he was just on the other side of my wall. My blinds were closed, so he couldn't see me, but the violation of it made my skin crawl. I couldn't decide if I should run out and confront him or keep watching to see what else he might do. That indecision cost me. He stayed there for almost a minute before finally backing away and disappearing from the camera's view. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the police again. I showed them the new footage. This time, a different officer came, a woman who seemed to take it more seriously. She agreed that the behavior was escalating and advised me to document everything, keep detailed notes of times and dates, and consider getting better cameras with higher resolution. She explained that without a clear view of his face or concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do right now. But she encouraged me to keep recording everything, saying that if this continued, we might have enough for a restraining order. She did go next door and talk to him. She didn't blame him, but asked if he had seen anything. Of course, he said he hadn't seen anything, and that was the end of it. Since then, he hasn't come around again. That was 3 weeks ago. I still go through my ritual of checking the blinds and testing the locks. I've thought about installing floodlights, so it would be easier to see him if it ever happens again. There is no guarantee he won't come back. He might be laying low until he feels things have settled down, or he might realize I'll never let my guard down again. Only time will tell, but I can say one thing for sure. I won't be going over there to borrow his weed eater. I've lived in apartments my whole adult life, and the golden rule is, mind your own business, keep your head down, and ignore whatever's happening on the other side of the wall. But recently something happened next door and I couldn't pretend I didn't notice it. Everything started about 2 months ago, right after someone new moved into 4B. I'm in 4A, and we share a wall, the one my couch sits against in the living room. For the first week or so, things were quiet. I didn't even know someone new was there until I saw a moving truck in the parking lot. and caught a glimpse of them carrying boxes up the stairs. A few days passed before anything weird started happening. It began with what sounded like a television turned up too loud. I'd hear muffled voices that sounded like the news, or a talk show running for hours on end. Plenty of people in apartments blast their TVs. I figured if I ran into them, I'd let them know it was loud. But then a few days later, the sound started to change. It wasn't just the TV anymore. There were these other noises mixed in, scraping and bumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It would happen at odd hours, sometimes at 3 in the afternoon, sometimes at 2 in the morning. The scraping would go on for a few minutes, then a bump, and then it stopped suddenly. After that, the TV sounds would resume. Every once in a while, there'd be thuds as well, separate from the other sounds. Not like someone dropping something or moving furniture. Usually, these were sharp one-offs that would rattle the picture frames on my wall. Other times, there'd be a series of them, like someone was hitting the wall with something. To top it all off, the worst part was the crying. Sometimes it sounded like a woman, sometimes like a child. It was hard to tell through the wall. The first time I heard it, I was watching a show. I paused it, and it took me a second to realize what it was. The crying went on for 10, maybe 15 minutes, then stopped. Afterwards, the TV would kick back on, loud as ever. This only happened maybe a handful of times, but it was concerning. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe they were watching true crime documentaries, or they had family visiting who were going through a hard time. But the sounds kept coming and they didn't let up. After about 3 weeks of this, I'd had enough. Some nights it would wake me up. When I had guests over, it was weird. And the sounds were invading my thoughts, even when they weren't happening. I'd lie in bed at night, waiting for the next thud, the next bout of crying, wondering what the hell was going on over there. I knocked on their door one evening around 7. It took a long time for them to answer. I could hear movement inside, footsteps shuffling around, and then stopping just on the other side of the door. I had the distinct feeling I was being watched through the peephole. Finally, the door cracked open about 6 inches. The smell hit me like a freight train. It was rotten and sweet at the same time, and kind of reminded me of boiled garbage. My neighbor stood in the gap, barely visible in the dim light from their apartment. They didn't say hello or ask what I wanted. They just stared at me with this blank expression. I explained that I lived next door and asked if they could keep the noise down, especially late at night. The whole time I was talking, they didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't even react at all. Once I finished, there was this long, uncomfortable pause before they finally spoke. They apologized in a flat, monotone voice and said they'd try to be quieter. Then they closed the door before I could say anything else. The smell lingered in the hallway for a few more minutes. I went back to my apartment feeling deflated, but I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The noises continued. If anything, they got even worse. The crying became more frequent, the thuds more violent. And now there were new sounds, a tapping like fingers drumming on glass, and occasionally what sounded like whispered conversations, too low to make out the words but constant and urgent. I knocked on the door again a week later. It all played out the same way. This time the smell was even stronger. I tried to be more direct and explained that the noise was really affecting my sleep and work. My neighbor gave me that same dead-eyed stare and repeated that they tried to be more quiet. It was word for word the same as last time. When the door closed, I noticed something I'd missed before. There was a dark stain on the carpet just inside their apartment. It looked wet, spreading out from somewhere deeper inside. That night, I heard the crying again, but this time it was different. It sounded closer to the wall, more desperate, and between the sobs, I could swear I heard words. "Help, please," over and over. A knot formed slowly in my stomach as my brain went over the implications of what I was hearing. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, debating whether to call the cops or not. Before I could make up my mind, I heard the scraping again, long and drawn out, like something being pulled across the wood floors we had. It went on for almost a full minute. When it stopped, there was a heavy thud against our shared wall, so hard one of my pictures fell. Then the noise stopped and was followed by complete silence, which was somehow worse than all the other noises. With bated breath, I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps moving toward the wall. They stopped, shy on the other side. Then came 3 slow knocks. I pulled away from the wall so fast I nearly tripped over my coffee table. In a rush, I grabbed my phone and opened it. I wasn't sure if I should call 911 or the non-emergency number. I decided on the non-emergency number. As soon as the call was answered, my mouth was running a mile a minute. I dumped it all out to the poor woman on the other line. The knocking, the sounds, the crying, and everything I thought was going on over there. She let me talk, and when I ran out of steam, she asked me to repeat everything slowly. It was then I realized I should go to the other room. If I could hear sounds from the other apartment, then they could hear me. After shutting the door to my bedroom, I went over everything again. The operator said they could send out a wellness check, but there wasn't much else they could do without solid evidence. I did hear some more bumping and dragging next door after that. It took the cops 2 hours to get there. I heard them knock on the neighbor's door, and I did try to listen in, but I couldn't make out much. 15 minutes after the cops had shown up, there was a scuffle. Now the officers were yelling, telling people to put their hands up. Bodies were slammed on the floor. I ran to my room in case things escalated. No shots were fired, thank goodness. Half an hour later, more cruisers showed up. Through the blinds in my window, I saw the neighbors being let out into the cop cars and taken away. The next day, the police came by to question me. They didn't tell me everything, except next door was a stash house for drugs. Nothing was manufactured there, only held until it was shipped out. They said I might see officers coming in and out for the next few days, and told me not to get in their way. I asked about the noises I had heard, and they didn't give me a solid answer. I can only guess at who was crying and why. When the new family moved in across the street, they seemed normal enough at first glance. The husband, wife, and 2 kids around the same age as mine. They kept their lawn mowed and their house looked decent from the outside. But it didn't take long for the facade to crack, especially for the husband. The first time we talked was when he came over to introduce himself about a week after they'd moved in. He seemed friendly, gave a good firm handshake, told me his name and that he worked in construction. Then I mentioned something about the weather, like how we were supposed to get snow later that week, and his response caught me totally off guard. He started talking about how the government controls the weather patterns, and that snow is just frozen chemtrails. He said this unironically, like he was telling me the sky was blue. I laughed at first, thinking he was joking, but he stared at me with this intense look and kept going, explaining his theory in detail. I eventually excused myself and went back inside, confused by the entire interaction. After that, every conversation with him followed a similar pattern. The words he used were normal. His sentences were grammatically correct. But nothing he said ever actually made sense in context. I'd ask him how his weekend was, and he'd tell me about how birds aren't real, and that the ones in our neighborhood were surveillance drones. I'd mention I was heading to the hardware store, and he'd launch into a speech about how retail stores are fronts for money laundering operations run by shadow organizations. It was like talking to someone who was having a completely different conversation than you were. My wife thought he was eccentric, but I got a bad feeling from him. There was something in his eyes when he talked, something frantic and unfocused. His movements were jerky and robotic. He'd pace while talking, scratching at his arms, shifting his weight from foot to foot constantly. I started to think he was on something. In late November, right before the first major snowstorm of the season, I saw him putting racing slicks on his minivan, completely bald with no tread whatsoever. I walked over and asked him if those were the right tires for winter driving. He tried to convince me that bald tires actually give you better traction in snow because there's more surface area touching the road. I tried to explain that wasn't how it worked, but he insisted I didn't understand physics and went back to what he was doing. The party started around the same time. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. Cars would show up at their house around midnight. Music would blast until 3 or 4 in the morning. Loud voices, people coming and going at all hours. I called the cops twice to complain about the noise, but by the time officers showed up, everything would be quiet and dark. It was odd how his kids were when they played with mine. They'd ride bikes together in the cul-de-sac, play basketball in our driveway, normal kid stuff. They all seemed fine, polite even, which made the whole situation even more confusing. But I made it clear to my children that they were not allowed to go inside the neighbor's house under any circumstance. If they wanted to play with them, it had to be outside or at our house. The activity at the house kept increasing. More cars, more late-night visitors. I'd see people I didn't recognize walking up to the door at 2 in the morning, staying for 5 minutes and then leaving. The neighbor's appearance got worse too. He lost weight rapidly. His skin looked terrible. The few times I saw him outside, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in February. My kids walked home from school every day. They'd usually get home around 3:30. That particular day, I decided to walk out and meet them at the corner like I sometimes did. I stepped out my front door and immediately knew something was wrong. There were police cars everywhere. Not just regular cops, SWAT was there too. Dudes in full gear were positioned around the neighbor's house. There was even sheriff deputies hanging around in the back. Before I could ask what was happening, one of the deputies came up and told me to get back inside my house immediately. He said they were conducting a raid and that I needed to stay indoors until they gave the all clear. And I started to argue, explaining that my kids would be walking home any minute and I needed to get them. But he cut me off. He radioed to someone else and told me that they'd meet my kids at the corner and that they would bring them to me. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and guided me back toward my front door and told me again to get inside and stay away from the windows. I went in, but immediately went to the living room window to watch. I took out my phone and called my wife at work to tell her what was happening. She told me to keep the kids inside no matter what, and that she was leaving early to come home. From the window, I watched the whole thing unfold. Officers approached the neighbor's house with a battering ram. There was yelling, though I couldn't hear exactly what they said from inside my house. Then they breached the door and swarmed inside. Within minutes, they were bringing people out in handcuffs. The neighbor, his wife, and two other people I'd never seen before. Fortunately, their kids weren't home. I found out later they'd been at school for some after-school program, which was probably the only reason the police chose that time to serve the warrant. After they cleared the house, I watched them carry out bag after bag of evidence. There was equipment I couldn't identify, boxes, containers. The operation lasted for hours. A detective came to my door later that evening to take a statement. That's when I learned the truth. The neighbor had been manufacturing and distributing meth out of his house. The late-night visitors were customers. The paranoid rambling conversations made a lot more sense now. The weight loss, the appearance, the erratic behavior. All classic signs of heavy meth use that I'd been seeing but didn't know exactly what it was. The detective asked if I'd ever seen anything suspicious. I told him about the parties, the traffic, and the strange behavior. He nodded like he'd heard it all before and thanked me for my time. Then he told me that we were lucky. Houses used for meth production can explode. Chemical fires and toxic fumes are all dangers of the production as well. My kids had been playing 50 feet away from a potential disaster. The house sat empty for a few weeks before a cleaning crew showed up in hazmat suits. After they were done, a new family moved in about 5 months later. The new family's been fine, but I'm a little hesitant to go meet them. I'm sure they're perfectly normal, but I'm gonna take my time getting to know them. Meeting Jess felt lucky at first. I'd been living alone in my home for about 6 months, working from there most days, keeping to myself, and hadn't had a girlfriend in a long, long time. She moved into the place next to mine sometime in early March. We had the same landlord, shared a yard and the driveway. Our homes practically touched, separated by maybe 15 feet of overgrown grass and a rusted chain link fence. I ran into her on a Thursday night. I'd just gotten back from picking up groceries, arms loaded with bags and fumbling for my keys in the dark. She was sitting on her stoop smoking a cigarette, and she called out to me, asked if I needed help. I said I was good, but we ended up talking for almost half an hour, while my frozen food slowly thawed in the bags at my feet. Right off the bat, she was funny and easy to talk to. She told me about the place she'd moved from, somewhere out east which I now forget the name of. My heart sank when she mentioned her partner was inside unpacking, but followed that up with maybe we could all grab drinks or something some other time. I'm not the type of person to go after someone else's girl, but there was an attraction there I couldn't deny, even though I knew there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. It would be a lie if I didn't say I was hoping she might turn single at some point. It felt natural when we exchanged numbers. She typed hers into my phone and sent herself a text so she'd have mine. She did it in a way that felt safe and neighborly. It didn't give me any red flags. The text started the next day. Just a good morning message, which was fine. A little forward maybe, but harmless. Then came the afternoon check-in, and the evening message asking what I was up to. By day 3, I was getting 10, sometimes 15 texts before noon. Most of them didn't even require responses. Simply observations, updates on her day, random thoughts she felt oddly compelled to share with me. The one that started to set off alarms was when she asked, "Where are you, love?" The love thing bothered me a lot. We barely knew each other. Now I know some people call everyone love or whatever, and maybe it was me trying to steer clear of an entanglement. But it hit a nerve. Even though I wanted to respond, I held back. That was when I started noticing her outside more, sitting on her stoop or standing in her doorway, always positioned where she could see my house, my window, or my car. If I left for any reason, she'd pop up out of nowhere, wave, walk over to chat, ask where I was headed, when I'd be back. I started to feel like I was on a leash. One evening, I glanced out my kitchen window while making dinner and saw her standing in her kitchen, staring directly at me. It wasn't coincidental. I could tell she was trying to get my attention by the way she stood there until I noticed. When our eyes met, she smiled and waved like this was completely normal behavior. Without a response, I closed my curtains. Whatever attraction I initially had now turned cold, and I was glad I hadn't been stupid enough to go after something that wasn't mine. The calls started after that. I'd be at the store and my phone would ring. Caller ID would tell me it was Jess. I'd let it go to voicemail, and 5 minutes later, there was another call. Then just a random text. Saw your cat in the window. She's so cute just sitting there watching the street. Another text 30 seconds later. You left your kitchen light on, by the way. I can tell you're not home though. The second text kind of made me feel nauseous. She was tracking me, knew when I was home based on which lights were on, knew where my cat liked to sit, was paying close enough attention to notice the difference between me being in another room and me being gone. I stopped responding to most of her messages, gave short, polite answers when I did reply, hoped she'd take the hint and back off. She didn't. The neighbors across the street, an older couple who'd lived there for years, mentioned something to me in passing one day. One of them asked if I knew the people in the house next door, said they contacted the landlord about something that bothered them. They didn't go into detail, but their discomfort was obvious. Months later, I found out they'd complained because Jess and her partner were constantly standing naked in their window, staring out at nothing. The landlord had asked them to put up curtains, but they'd refused. If all of this wasn't enough, soon the money requests started coming. The first voicemail started off with her apologizing for being weird. She went into detail about how the move had been tough. She'd been going through a lot lately and some other stuff that didn't make much sense. Then she started crying, which had the opposite effect than what she wanted, I'm sure. She asked if I could float her $20 just until Friday. There was some lame reason that her car speakers had blown, and she really needed to replace them. She'd pay me back as soon as she got paid, she said. I didn't even bother responding. The next request came 2 days later, $50 this time. She had to buy a birthday present for a friend and didn't have anything left in her account. The voicemail was longer and more desperate. She'd pay me back with interest, she promised. More requests followed, different amounts, different reasons. Going out with friends, buying groceries, an unexpected bill. The voicemails got longer and more manipulative. One ended with her saying she'd have to stay home alone like usual, making it sound like I was personally responsible. I had enough and blocked her number. What was once attraction now soured into repulsion, but I couldn't block her physically. She was still there in that window, on that stoop, and I could feel her watching me. I started changing my routine, turned off lights and moved through my apartment in the dark, parked my car around the corner instead of in the driveway, stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary. When I did leave, I'd peek through the blinds first, wait until I was sure she wasn't outside, then scamper to my car like a cockroach running from the light. Some nights I didn't come home at all. Instead, I'd stay at my sister's place or crash on a friend's couch. Made up excuses about needing a change of scenery or wanting company. I couldn't admit that I was afraid to sleep in my own apartment, that the place I'd felt completely safe in just weeks ago now felt like a trap. My landlord called me in early May, asked if I'd noticed any issues with the tenants in the other house. I told him everything. The constant text and calls, the money requests, the stalking. He listened quietly and said he'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I realized her car wasn't in the driveway anymore. I heard from the neighbors across the street that she'd been evicted. Something had gone down that had nothing to do with me. Some violation of the lease I never got details about. But whatever it was enough. That all happened a year ago. New neighbors moved in, a nice couple with a kid. I found a girlfriend and have been dating for 2 months now. Just never came around again, which was a relief. But every once in a while, when I'm walking past my kitchen window, out of the corner of my eye I catch a glimpse of Jess, and I have to remind myself it's only my imagination. You have been watching Noir, a Radion production brought to you by Trapper Dan, the finest in canned survival food.